I need to hit the record button. And I have really been looking forward to this discussion for quite some time, since my path crossed with Brent Green, who is a prolific author, but one of his most recent books is Questions of the Spirit. And that is going to be a platform for our discussion today. But before we dive into this discussion, let's get to know Brent a little bit better. So I would love to welcome Brent Green to the stage. And hey, there you are, Brent. And how you're in what looks like it should be sunny Colorado. Is it sunny there today?
It's absolute. We call it a bluebird sky when it's this clear outside. This was after a day of snow most of yesterday. We didn't get in too deep, didn't cause major traffic jams, but it nevertheless happened. And the day before that, it was about 70 degrees. Yeah. So welcome to spring in Denver.
Yeah, well, the cool thing is we've got people from all over the country who signed up for this today, but most of our folks are enjoying their lunch in the Mid-Atlantic. But Brent, I'm really charged up about this discussion that you've proposed today, and but before we do that, because we are going to be talking about the topic of grief and, some painful, what might be what I think is thought-provoking, but could be painful. I just want to remind everybody that this discussion is just for educational purposes, and it should not be thought of as therapeutic treatment. If anyone is attending or struggling with losing someone, they should seek out grief counseling or organized grief groups in their community. And, thank you, Brent, for suggesting that before our discussion. I think I'm going to do a similar disclaimer with all of our discussions because, we're just having discussions on very thought-provoking topics that can sometimes be painful, but it's just a great reminder to let people know that that's all these are, but we hope we can connect you with some great resources. But so after that, Brent, before we dive into this discussion, tell folks a little bit about yourself. You've got a really interesting background.
In a nutshell, I actually started my career after graduate school as a rehabilitation psychologist, and I worked with the state of Kansas and a esteemed psychiatric hospital called the Menninger Foundation. So I do have a background in therapy and counseling, but I set that aside after a few years and went into the field of marketing. And that's where I stayed for the next 40 years. I've worked with major clients like McDonald's or a well-known resort hotel in Colorado by the name of the Broadmoor. I work with brand names like HP and brands like OxyClean. So it covered a vast range of clients over that many years. And my company provided direct marketing, advertising, promotions, public relations initiatives, and so forth. And through that time, I had many opportunities to volunteer. I was the head of tourism in Colorado Springs as chairman of the board of directors, and ended up doing that a great deal of my time in the area of Colorado tourism. And I was on boards with various professional communities as well. So anyway, I do have an eclectic background, but I am drawn to the subject we're talking about today because, like most people in this audience, I assume one thing we have in common is we've all lost somebody, if not somebodies. So it's a universal issue, and it's of great importance to me, which I can proceed to explain with some detail.
And you've written numerous books on a variety of topics, but this one of the reasons that our path crossed is that you wrote this book, Questions of the Spirit, and I'll make sure to share a link to that if anybody's interested in it. But I love having authors on these discussions because to put together a book, you have to really think deeply and do a lot of research and talk to people to compile, all that info. And so I think today you're going to share a little bit of, what we can do to think differently about grief and loss and things of that.
That's correct. And I will tell one of my secrets about how I wrote that specific book. My pathway there was unique.
Yeah, so let's jump into it. So I'll let you drive the bus here, and but I'm curious what that pathway is. You sort of teed it up for me.
All right, Steve, I'll take it from there. Well, like most of us on this phone call, I had aging parents. They had a happy retirement in Topeka, Kansas. And, my sister and I would go visit them periodically and check in. But eventually, my mother developed Parkinson's disease, and my father did his very best to be the primary caretaker. He did a terrific job. But as he aged, his ability to take care of her started diminishing. So unfortunately, we had to make a deep decision of taking her into skilled care, where my father spent most of his days going to the nursing home and visiting her. His health slipped, and eventually he went into a separate assisted living facility. My sister and I, Julie, found that untenable to take care of our parents so far away. So with a little resistance, well, actually a lot of resistance, my parents agreed to move to Denver. And because there was not a CCRC or continuing care retirement community nearby, my dad went into assisted living about 3 miles to the east of me, and my mother was in a long-term care facility 2 miles to the west of me. So I was running 5 miles back and forth daily, taking care of my parents. Eventually, my father's care needs slipped. He had a heart attack, and he went into skilled care. Much to the initial objection of the long-term care facility, the nursing home, they said, we can't have your parents in the same room. We can't do that. They need separate rooms. I recall that when we would have a discussion about their demise with my parents, my dad would insist, your mother and I want to be in our bedroom and die in our bed together. Well, I kept pushing, and they were then put into the same room in twin hospital beds. Over about 5 months, my father's health continued to slip. My mother was stable with Parkinson's, but still needing care. But he continued slipping, and my sister came to Denver, and we realized that we were in the final days. They were going to be getting hospice care. My father struggled quite a bit with breathing, but I was so amazed at my sister, Julie, how great she was as a caretaker. She was older and had been trained as an EMT since she had healthcare background. But I remember leaning over my father's bed and say, you can go, Daddy. You can leave now. Your work is done. Everything is okay. Just go to the light. And she did that several times. And then eventually he did stop breathing. We went over to, after we took care of the initial impact of losing my dad, we went to a nearby funeral home and cemetery where we were arranging a final viewing. And I got a call from my brother-in-law, Joel, and he said, you need to come back to the nursing home. Your mother has collapsed. And even though she seemed good when we left the nursing care, she was actually starting to have breakfast. She totally did collapse, and she died 18 hours after my father. So we had a double impact. And, although this is rare, it's not totally uncommon where older adults die very close together. You might remember Carrie Fisher with the star of Princess Leia in the Star Wars fantasy trilogy. She had a heart attack coming back from London and died 4 days later. Her mother, Debbie Reynolds, a tremendously well-known actress from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, she died 1 day later. And there's actually a term for that. It's called broken heart syndrome, or more technically, stress-induced cardiomyopathy. So anyway, we were dealing with a lot, as you can imagine. My sister happened to have a great sense of humor in addition to having a lot of compassion, and a little humor mixed in with grief does not hurt. She said, "Can you imagine our dad in this situation, sitting us around a table?" He said, "Kids, your mother and I have decided we're going to die in close proximity to each other. Now think of how much that's going to save you. You're only going to have one memorial service. You'll only need to pay one pastor instead of two. All those travel expenses will be cut in half. And son, if you follow what I've taught you and bargain well, you might get a discount on urns, such as buy one, get one free." Well, of course, that allowed us to have a few moments of comic relief. And that certainly doesn't hurt. Now I'm going to fast forward you 15 years later. This was 2000.
Before you jump into that, number one, thank you so much for sharing that story. Everybody's journey is a little bit different, but I know that folks in our community, the story that you're telling of, driving around to various communities and communicating with the leadership of a community on, your request to have mom and dad in the same room, and, the denial at first, and then, your tenacity to make that happen. It's a very common journey that we hear quite a bit. And, you heard at the open that that solo aging is our number one topic of discussion. And because the broken heart syndrome is a real thing, and a lot of people do pass away at the same time, but most of us are surprisingly left alone by our spouse. As much as I think we all think that, me and my spouse are going to pass away at the same time.
My sister had the insight, Steve, that my mother, who seemed to be the sicker with Parkinson's disease, although she was rebounding and becoming clearer because they fortunately reduced her medication by half after a good geriatrician said she's being over medicated. After that was figured out, but my sister said, my mother's not going to leave until my dad passes away, and then she will leave very shortly after that time. And that is indeed what happened.
Wow.
So
your sister sounds very insightful and a great communicator in a time like this. So, okay. Keep on going, Brent. This is great.
All right. So we're going to fast forward 15 years. This was 2000 when my parents died within 18 hours of each other. My sister, unfortunately, was diagnosed with lung cancer in 2012. And as good as it can be, she had a good run with cancer with certain medications that were able to alleviate symptoms. But in 2015, she was losing that battle. And I happened to be in Norway with my wife, Becky, at a time when we got a call from my brother-in-law, Joel, saying, "You need to come home. Your sister is now in hospice care in our home, and she doesn't have long." So we rerouted our trip and got to their home in Gilroy, California, where many members of the family had gathered. And my sister, by that point, was in a coma. Unfortunately, I did not get to speak with her. But we were in deep grief, and she was being cared for by Vistas Hospice organization. And I heard a knock on her front door. I answered the door, and a man was there that gave me a calming presence that I cannot easily describe. But it made me feel like somebody was there that knew what they were doing and cared. His name was Mark McGann. And Mark came into the house, said, why don't the family get together and sit around a table together? Let's have a conversation. And so we did. And he looked at us very calmly, very empathetically, and he asked one question: is there value in suffering? Now, you think about that in the context of your sibling is dying 50 feet away. That's like a non sequitur. Are you kidding me? Of course we're suffering. Of course there's suffering. But that was a thoughtful question. And my family members and I ended up digging pretty deep in answering that question. And it actually flipped me back to the time 15 years earlier when my parents passed away. During the time right after their death, I was in a deep fog. I was sad. I was having difficulty with concentration. I was bored. I was pessimistic about life. And then I had this epiphany. This moment came to me where I felt a call. And that call was for adventure. If you remember Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist, he said that sometimes we will be called to take an adventure, a mythic spiritual journey. And my sister and I, or excuse me, my wife and I landed on the idea of going to Amsterdam, Holland. We'd always been inspired to go there, but again, it was a call. When we got off the airplane and looked around that great city, immediately something started lifting. We were mesmerized. We went to see Rembrandt's studio, the original studio he painted in. We went to the Rijksmuseum where we saw his masterpiece called Night Watch, which is breathtaking. We went to the Van Gogh Museum where we saw most of the master's works. We walked the canals at daytime and nighttime and sampled international cuisine. And something happened to me. My creativity was set on fire. Now, at that time, my creativity was realized through one of these, a camera. And it so happened that I had schlepped the old film cameras with me with strobes and so forth. Now, for you millennials in the audience, this is known as a slide, professionally called a film transparency. And the goal was to take photos on slides. And I decided I wanted to create an exhibition with large size photographs. So let me take a second to show you what I mean. Get this in the right proportion. I can see that there's some reflection on it, but this is the master's studio. This is Rembrandt's studio. It was pretty spare. There was a bust of Rembrandt and then Rembrandt's actual easel. So I created a graphic solution to present this idea of Rembrandt and his studio. And then walking around the streets, I often came into photographs like this. Now I call this blondes, which it's actually a melding of digital photography and actual photography, because the only color in it are two blonde women intensely working together on their bicycles. Now, talking about positive aging, I witnessed the Amsterdam Marathon, and I had a series in this. These guys in the background are younger men trying to keep up with the older man, probably in his 80s. He was showing them how to run a marathon. So that was my positive aging moment. One more example. We were walking late at night near the Rijksmuseum, and a tunnel that goes into the museum at that time. And there was this young woman all by herself playing the flute. Now, if you notice carefully, there is ominous hands reaching out to her from behind. So that was part of my photographic journey, is to juxtapose elements. If you look at her fingers on the flute, they line up perfectly with the ominous man's thumb. So all in all, I took 30 or 40 photos that I kept, probably several hundred. I'll just leave that there for reference. And I decided to bring it back to Denver and create a gallery exhibition, which I did. I was rewarded by having almost 100 people come to it at a famous coffee shop in Washington Park called Stella's, my favorite coffee shop on the planet. And what happened is my grief lifted. And I guess the point that this is leading to is that I wanted to create visual images of living and not suffering. So what actually happened here is that I would probably have not even gone to Amsterdam had my parents not died. It would not have called me. I would not have seen the visual elements that I just shared with you, the juxtaposition of elements. I would not have been diligent to schlep around all that camera equipment. I would not have tried to master Photoshop so I could create the digital images. I would not have taken those images to a service bureau. Remember, this was in 2000 at the early stage of digital printing. And I would not have risked taking my work into an exhibition where friends and colleagues might go, well, we can see that he can't take photos. Someday you're going to lose somebody close. We all are. And what I discovered is that suffering can be liberated by the creator. Whatever creative outlet you would choose, whether it's painting or dance or writing or poetry or guitar playing, whatever lets you free, and something else extra happens, and that's called the flow experience. If you can imagine Michelangelo lying on his back, painting the Sistine Chapel, the flow experience is complete immersion in an activity. And that's how we can move away from our suffering, but at the same time express it. Now, we all know Helen Keller. She was born actually sighted and could hear until 19 months, and then she had meningitis. She was completely blind and completely deaf. But yet that woman wrote 12 books. She was the first deaf and blind person to get a baccalaureate degree. Again, she lectured everywhere, and she wrote, "Character cannot be developed in ease and quiet. Only through the experience of trial and suffering can the soul be strengthened, ambition inspired, and success achieved." So my challenge to all of us and to you, when you lose again, is there some creative source you can tap into to express your grief or to work through it? And that's the end of that story, Steve.
I love it. And, you know, I think one of the things all of us, and feel free, folks, if you want to sort of throw in your comments on this topic of, you know, suffering. And it's, I guess, how we all interpret this is a little bit different. Is that I think, you know, when you first introduced this concept to me when we met, Brent, I kind of leaned into the fact that a lot of the sports that I like to play, to participate in, have a lot of suffering involved, you know, in endurance sports. And you know, and then the more that I've thought about that, it's been stuck in my head. It's kind of like, well, is that really like, you know, how can creativity be blended into an activity like that? And the more that I think about it, it's sort of how when I'm on an 8-hour bike ride and I am suffering, there's a lot of creativity in how I get through that pain. But I also can equally reflect on the value, because I like doing mosaic art, and the time that I reflect on that. But oftentimes, and this is what I think is a little bit different, I think that a lot of us, when we're participating in creative activities, it's an enjoyable activity, but I never thought about it being a therapeutic and helping me through some challenging times, whether it be grief or loss, or just immersing myself in various thoughts.
Well, I might add that one of the things I promised in this little discussion on this story was, okay, so what's that? How does this relate to the book? Well, it turns out that Mark McGann, the hospice pastor, who actually incidentally had a law degree, which was an interesting life choice, my brother-in-law kept meeting with him in grief group, a grief group following the death of my sister, his wife. And every time Mark would come to a meeting, he would have a new question, a new profound question. Well, 18 of those questions that Mark brought to the grief group became 18 chapters in my book. And this is an example. And the book also includes many more questions, but each chapter is themed by a question. And then there's ancillary questions. And ancillary to this, is there value in suffering, is this question coming from the book. What forms of creativity can you enthusiastically pursue today that could lend meaning and tangible expression to your suffering? Same question in a little different way. And so that's exactly how the book got built.
Now, this is great, and I love any exercise that asks questions, because it enables us all to reflect individually, and especially these questions. I know there's no right or wrong answer. It's not like we're in the 5th grade where we're taking a quiz. These are thought-provoking questions, and I've seen the book. But let's back up a little bit, because you introduced the topic of grief groups, okay? And I like how you shared the story of your brother-in-law losing his wife, and fortunately all of your paths crossed Mark McGann. He sounds like a wonderful human.
Incredible.
But
amazing guy.
But tell us a little bit about the power of a grief group, and I'm assuming that that these are in most communities around the country.
They are, and it's obviously a very ancillary part of hospice. So should you have a friend, relative, loved one being cared for by hospice, almost all hospices include grief groups as part of the process, available and paid for by the Medicare or other health insurance for the grieving people. So it's very common to have that. And grief groups open a door for discussion, because part of dealing with grief is achieving insights and the power of human communication. Because as I started my conversation today, we all have lost somebody, and we're going to all lose other somebodies the longer we live. If you can imagine a centenarian, and we know that many centenarians are very, very vigilant and robust and engaged and love life. I think of Dick Van Dyke as an example. He's not quite 100, but he's 99. People really engaged. But you think about those people, they've lost everybody. They've lost spouses, friends, relatives, parents, so many people, but they're able to withstand that loss and integrate it into their lives. And we can learn so much. So grief groups give us an opportunity for human communication. And obviously, for those of you who have been in therapy or give therapy, questions are very much a part of the therapeutic process. The right question at the right time, asking for a thoughtful answer, a heartfelt answer, can lead to therapeutic improvement, to better emotional health. So it's part of the process. Now, we baby boomers have developed our own twist on this that's becoming popular around the country. It's called Dinner and Death.
Oh,
And the
yeah.
permanent,
I've been trying to get that group on one of our discussions. Yeah.
right. It can be a very interesting dinner. Nobody's dying. It's not about immediate grief, but it's dealing with the abstract concept is we're all going to die. How we integrate that into our lives um, and move forward productively is the purpose of these grief groups. Death and dinner.
Yep.
So,
I
and,
yeah, it's death over dinner. And I'm dropping that into chat if folks are interested. And if anybody knows somebody with that organization, let me know, because I would love to spotlight that. I think that's a very positive activity. The Holly says, it does not sound appetizing, but I get the point. Thanks, Holly. Yeah. But Holly, I want to, on this topic, one of the benefits that I've gained from doing over 300 of these discussions on every topic under the sun, but I would be willing to say that death and dying creeps into 10 to 15%, if not 20% of these discussions, no matter what we're talking about, is that I will say that the topic of death and loss is sad in many ways, but I look forward to these talks because I think that when I'm talking about death just with somebody that I'm close to, it's a very authentic and raw topic that leads to less superficial conversation that sometimes can be more annoying. You can have some very deep conversations about death, and it's something that we all have to go through. I want to spotlight a few of the comments that folks can see in chat, but for those that are listening to this, I'm really glad that we've got William in the audience. He's a chaplain. He served as a chaplain at a CCRC, and he reiterates that broken heart syndrome is fairly well documented, and he saw it in his role there. He folks, you can see William's comments. They're great. Leslie says creativity brings us closer to the creator and forces us to look around at this new neighborhood and re-identify ourselves at a higher level. Very well said, Leslie. And William says, thanks for listing grief support groups. Grieving is best done in grief, and grieving is best done in grief settings. We all need the support to others. And he also mentions that solo grieving often results in despair. And man, William, you're getting the gold star today for sharing resources. He also mentions death cafes. On the topic of talking about death, if you search in your area on Google death cafes, and I can give you some virtual death cafes, these are wonderful places where you can go. It's, to in a very non-judgmental way and talk about death and exercise that muscle, because I think the more we do it, the more natural it becomes and the more positive you begin to view these conversations. Okay, I was just on a rant there, Brent, sharing some resources.
no, I appreciate that. And when you talk about Will, it's actually Dr. William Randolph, who was the head of older adult services for the Methodist Church nationally when we met. And he invited me to an event that he called Boomer Stock, and it was to help the church rethink its pastoral care of the large and coming baby boom generation into that stage of life when people get a lot more serious about their spiritual lives. So I'm honored that Will's involved in this conversation, and thank you for coming, Will. Appreciate it.
Oh, great. Yeah, thank you. And Okay, so let's see. Now, did we have another, you had another topic that you wanted to introduce?
Right.
Okay,
That's correct.
all
All
right.
right. So this is going to take us into a different question on an entirely different pathway, but hopefully give you a broader understanding of what we mean by questions of the spirit. I received an email on November the 24th, 2013, and I'll read it to you. Hi, Brent and Becky. Becky is my wife. Thinking of you guys at holiday time, long overdue for a Denver visit, maybe early next year. Hope this year has been a good one for you. Look forward to catching up soon. I am off to Seattle for Thanksgiving with sister and family. We lost my nephew to cancer this year, so it will be a melancholy event. A quick trip to LA for business and friends pre-Christmas, then off to Chicago for New Year's with Barbara, my ex. We have reconnected. See you soon, maybe. Utah John Darren, and he spells Utah Yewtaw, Utah John Darren. Well, little did I know, and certainly he didn't know, that John had 16 weeks to live when I got this email. I actually met him during my marketing career at Business Radio Network. I was in charge of producing advertising, direct mail, sales promotions, public relations programs as an outside vendor, and he was the vice president of marketing. He had a Hollywood career that was amazing. I remember him driving into the radio network's parking lot the first time in a bright taxi cab yellow Porsche Carrera with a black convertible top. He had on the sunglasses, and I thought, is Paul Newman coming to the network today for an interview? Well, it turned out that was Johnny, or John Darren, as his stage name was. And I learned that he was an LA celebrity. He'd been a major player in the growth of AM and then FM radio. He was in TV news in LA. He was in the big time. He was also a producer of infomercials. So if you watched infomercials in the 90s and the aughts, chances are you saw John as a host. So, for example, he had Johnny's Cooking Show. I'm making that up, but that was roughly the point of it. And people would bring on gadgets and do an infomercial around the gadget. You remember Ginsu knives?
Oh yeah.
That was his deal.
Oh
He
boy.
actually introduced Ginsu as a celebrity. He produced infomercials for AARP, and then all kinds of odd projects like Brazilian soybeans that are non-GMO, and gold coins, and pre-cremation advanced services. So, he was a busy guy with a lot of things going on all the time, and he loved to travel and drive across the country in his sports cars. Anyway, I did not hear from him in all of 2014. Remember, this email came to me in December 2013. And I'm kind of feeling like, wow, he usually sends a Christmas card. In fact, it was always handwritten, which is starting to be pretty unusual. Most people don't. So I was walking around a lake near my home with Becky. I said, I'm going to give him a call. So I called his cell phone, disconnected. I called his home office, phone number disconnected. I sent him a quick email. It bounced. So Becky and I rushed home. She got on one computer upstairs. I got on this computer down here. We started Google searching, and we saw the Google query that nobody ever wants to see. A well-known other LA talent by the name of Dick Heatherton had written a lamentation about John and that he'd passed away. Now, Dick Heatherton might sound familiar to some of you older guests attending this, because Joey Heatherton was his sister. She was actually very famous back in the 60s and 70s and dated Frank Sinatra. But Dick Heatherton was a close friend of Johnny. And I learned that after my email that he had sent me, he did do everything and went to see Barbara in Chicago and had a lot of back pain. He went to a doctor in January and he was basically given a couple of months to live. And he died on March 9th, 2014. What was difficult for me to handle was I had not any awareness of this until 9 months after John died, 16 weeks after I had received that email from him. I don't know if you remember the movie Out of Africa, but the book was written by Isaac Dinesen. And she wrote, all the sorrows of life are bearable if only we can convert them into a story. So here's my story about John Darren, AKA John Christian Miller. He was a radio personality. He was a peripatetic traveler. He was a car lover. He was a TV host. He was an author, an entrepreneur, and he was always a periodic rush of energy. Now, here's a photo of him when I was in Aspen with him, and he quite, characteristically put his arm around this statue of a cowboy reading and joined the reading with him. And I think you can kind of see the LA vibe, the celebrity vibe that he put out there. What did I learn? Well, I learned three things. What is normal in our lives can change on a dime. What is true today, this morning, could change this afternoon. Number two, absence of communication from a friend is communication. Number three, I can do a better job. Brent can do a better job of staying in touch. Leading me to a question for you. Who might you text, email, pick up the phone and call, or even go see soon? So the theme of this chapter was, has your self-esteem changed? And the point of this story relative to that is my self-esteem was injured by the fact that I was so careless with a friendship that he had died 9 months before I even knew about it. And that I found out in such an impersonal way. So that's the exploration that led me to.
Man, what a great story. And I think that many of us, I know personally that this is a great reminder, because oftentimes I'm reminded of this when I'm at a memorial service. And I will say, when I'm lucky enough to be invited to a memorial service, because oftentimes it's very difficult for the family to communicate with all the lives that an individual touches. And but if I'm at the memorial service, I'm oftentimes saying that to myself. But I've, just like you, have missed quite a few folks that all of a sudden you realize they're no longer with us. And I wish that I had reached out. So this is great. Hey, we got some great comments and we got some questions, but that was an amazing thought. Well,
thank you, Steve. I might add that, just as a matter of explanation, how could that happen? I mean, we're in the world of instant communications. We almost find out about a death after 2 seconds after our heart stops. John traveled in an LA group of talent in the LA area. None of them knew me. None of them knew of our friendship. I was in a different world with him. So that's why I didn't necessarily hear about it. But, I could have waited. I mean, I could have jumped on this sooner than 9 months after he died. I could have even checked back with him in February and I would have talked to him. So anyway.
I think I may have already talked about it, but on Friday, we are talking about intentionally building, managing, and looking at our networks. Is that so many of us have connections, and the longer you've lived, and if you are out there enjoying purposeful activities, you could be connected to hundreds or thousands of people, but there's very few people that actually document that and intentionally look at it and see where they have strengths and weaknesses. But another value to documenting your network is exactly what you're talking about, is that, you know, reaching out on a regular basis to folks that matter in your life, even if they're not in close proximity. So that's great. Well, let me jump on a few of these comments, and we can circle back here, obviously. But Jeff Rubin, who's another author who's been featured on our discussions, and I'll drop.
I know Jeff. Yeah.
Oh, you know Jeff, man, all your friends.
Oh, yeah.
Today. But Jeff says many people at the end of life question whether their lives had meaning. Can you touch on that in terms of an individual dying and how their family members might consider in responding to that? Great question, great question, Jeff.
A little challenging too, Jeff. Thank you. Well, I think we need to examine what people have done throughout their lives that have led to meaningful consequences. I think every one of us and the people that we love have stories, and those stories we need to capture. One thing that I did with my father while he was in assisted care before he went into long-term care was I interviewed him on video. And that video is so precious to me today, because while I was playing the videographer, I was hearing what he was saying, but I wasn't necessarily digesting it. When I play the video now, 20 years later,
oh my God,
there are so many lessons that my father contributed to my own well-being and outlook on life and choices and decisions that I made. And that becomes clarified. And there are people that are specializing in helping older adults with memoirs or storytelling. And it can be verbal storytelling, it can be written storytelling. But I think it's so important that we let them tell their stories so that they know they're being heard. And far into the future, those stories will be available. And the opportunity to develop online vaults, if you will, for people's stories, it's unlimited in terms of how much we can store. It just takes concerted effort to say, let's make sure that we know what these people know and get their stories. I don't know if that helps, Jeff, if that's getting closer to the answer. But
I thought that was great. Is that and in fact, I just dropped a link into. There's hundreds of options to help us document our life stories or our loved ones' life stories. One that my brother and I bought for my parents is called Storyworth, and it just kind of runs you through these chapters and it creates a book. And my dad just completed it and we're reading his book right now. But I think sometimes, when people question whether their lives have meaning, I think, these are things that we need to remind ourselves to communicate with the loved ones around us while they're here on this planet, and that can certainly help. Okay, let me see where we are here. I dropped a bunch of folks have had some really great suggestions for some TED Talks and YouTubes. I put those in there. Let's see. Phyllis says, I was in a grief group for 6 years after my husband died. Being in a group where others understood and where you feel like you were not burdening others. Yeah, I think that in fact, I was in a discussion just recently where somebody's spouse had passed away and somebody was commenting on how they can't let go. They're always talking about their spouse. Well, there's nothing the matter with that if you want to talk about that, and if you want to find a welcoming place where people are going to be more receptive. It's probably a grief group as opposed to your girlfriend who is can't get in that state of mind because she may or may not have gone through a loss or can share that empathy with you at that time. But Phyllis, thank you for sharing that, because I think we've all overheard people saying it's like, oh, I wish Ginger would just get over her husband and stop talking about it so much. And it's horrible even when I hear it coming out of my mouth, but I've heard statements like that so many times.
Mhm.
Dr. Randolph says, I think the wrong time to really think about mortality is when we are actively dying. It's like doing homework before a big test. This is why Questions of the Spirit is such a treasure book. Dr. Randolph, thank you for sharing that, because one thing that I wanted to do before, because I see we're getting close to the top of the hour, I wanted to pull up the Question for the Spirit book. I put this in Amazon, but I'm going to scroll down here to the table of contents. And Brent, if you can, and so we've talked about the chapter, is there value in suffering? And then he's got further questions about suffering to consider. Can someone have courage to face suffering? Can someone's courage to face suffering strengthen us? Have you ever experienced desperation? Do you believe in the power of forgiveness? What was your first ever experience of loss? Can you experience the person you lost outside your ego? And how much do you contemplate your death? These are great questions, Brent.
Well, we can thank Mark McGann for that. And again, I've added to the 18 questions that became the chapter themes, total of over 100 questions, designed for discussion in groups, actually. And they can inspire this conversation. So,
and is that folks can find that on your website?
What's that?
The group questions.
They're all in the book.
They're all in the book. Okay, sorry about that. Okay,
that's okay.
Let's see.
Yeah.
Let me get back to some of these. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Dr. Randolph has got a really good longer statement in there. Everybody read that. I'll have all this stuff with the recording too this afternoon. Leslie says we need to learn how to guide dying people, not about life, but what it is that they are going through in the dying process. Forget regrets and guide them into a peaceful trip through the various levels of dying. Very well said, Leslie. And
yes, excellent. And I saw my sister do that with my parents.
Yeah, you gave us a great example of that.
She gave them permission to move through the final stage of life and know that they were loved and cared as they exited this realm we're in.
And Phyllis talks about how her patients and their families benefit from reviewing their departing this life before death. And she's had grandkids interview their grandparents. And what a wonderful thing. I mean, think about it, folks. I mean, most of us, I believe, in this audience were, we lost our parents, and many of us lost our parents and grandparents before the digital age. And I think about this all the time is that, man, if I just had a video of my grandmother, I would just love to look at that from time to time and have her talking about her life and the meaning of life. And even I remember at my grandmother's deathbed in the hospital and how she just gripped my hand. If I had a iPhone at that time, I would have loved to just recording her gripping my hand and not saying anything, and how powerful that would be to share with my kids, and or just help me through tough times and to help me through suffering, you know?
I actively encourage people to do that, Steve. I have friends that uh, their spouses are passing away, and I've asked that question open-ended. Have you recorded what this person has to share about their life and what they've learned? Most people that are, in hospice care but capable of communication are more than willing to share their life stories, as well as the lessons that all of us can take away from their lives. So it's there.
Man.
It just has to be recorded. And thankfully for the technology, there's no excuses now.
And Brent, I'm going to have a little request as we wrap this up. Your friend, Dr. Randolph, is amazing. And folks,
I know that.
some of the comments that are in there in chat there, I would love to welcome you back, and Dr. Randolph, if you were open to joining us for a discussion on, it sounds like you've had a lot of personal real life experience with death and dying in a variety of settings, and hospice and CCRC. But I love this. I love this statement that he says. When I served as a hospice chaplain, there were times when I observed that persons only really began to live their lives when they were actively dying. And what a powerful statement and a reminder to all of us. And I think we've all seen people in that situation, where they started living when they got that, cancer diagnosis or something like that. And we need to remind ourselves and our loved ones to start living right now.
Absolutely.
So
I have a quote to share, if I could, Steve, as we're coming to a close. It's such a powerful quote, and I actually heard it from Neil deGrasse Tyson, the #1 astrophysicist and spokesperson for science in the country. And he has a video on YouTube about death and dying. And he quoted Horace Mann, who was a 19th century educator, as follows. And this was on the epitaph on Horace Mann's tombstone. I beseech you to treasure up in your hearts these my parting words. Be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity. Mm. And I think one of the conclusions of our discussions today is that we can have victories for humanity as we unshackle ourselves from grief and move on and create a new life. And one of the concluding comments in my book is that you may be just one question away from an entirely different life.
Man, I love it. Brent, the thought that you put into this, your book, and the ideas that you've inspired us to think about. This is a wonderful discussion today. And I'm glad it's recorded, because this is something that can help folks, that we all can share this, and it can help folks that stumble into the recording as well. But I also really want to thank a wonderful audience to help us with this discussion today.
Absolutely.
As always, that is the bonus of these things, is, the folks that we focus on, that we spotlight on the stage, inspire you all to share some great ideas and resources. So Brent, enjoy your sunny day there in Colorado, and folks, let's just use today as a reminder to continue living life, make connections, ask questions, and Brent, I hope that you've inspired everybody to think about creative pursuits that you can enjoy now that can also help you through times of loss and suffering.
I wish everybody well. Thank you, Steve, so much for all the work you put into putting on this presentation. Very professional. I'm most impressed. And thank you again for inviting me to be on the program. It's quite a useful series, and I look forward to sitting in the audience on the future programs coming up.
I love it. Talk to you soon.